What if everything you know about the 20th century is a carefully constructed lie? What if the pivotal moments, the wars, the revolutions, the political turning points, weren't accidents of history but were engineered from the shadows? For decades, the truth was locked away, stamped top secret, and buried in the deepest vaults of power. But the archives have finally been cracked open. Tonight, we journey into the darkness. We examine 10 classified operations so explosive, so consequential, they didn't just change history. They rewrote it. From CIA coups to KGB disinformation, from phantom attacks to secret armies, this is the real story of how intelligence agencies secretly manipulated the course of global politics. If you're ready to see behind the curtain, subscribe to the Forbidden Archives. The truth is our only mission. Now, let's begin with Operation 1. Operation Ajax, the coup that shaped the Middle East. The story of the modern Middle East cannot be told without understanding the seismic event that occurred in the summer of 1953. An event not born from popular revolution or regional war, but from a meticulously planned covert operation authorized in the halls of Washington and London. Operation Ajax, executed by the American Central Intelligence Agency with British intelligence support, represents one of the first and most consequential peacetime covert actions of the Cold War. Its target was not a military installation, but a democratically elected government. Its objective was the overthrow of Iran's prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, and the restoration to absolute power of the young Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The official rationale, framed for public consumption and internal policy documents, centered on the threat of communist takeover and the nationalization of the British-controlled Anglo-Iranian oil company, which threatened Western economic interests. But the declassified files, particularly the CIA's own internal history released in 2013, reveal a far more cynical and far-reaching plot, a blueprint for how a great power could manipulate a sovereign nation's political destiny through a campaign of bribery, propaganda, and orchestrated violence. The stage was set in 1951, when Mossadegh, a nationalist aristocrat with a deep commitment to constitutional monarchy and Iranian sovereignty, led the parliament to unanimously vote for the nationalization of Iran's oil industry. This act directly challenged British imperial power, which had enjoyed immense profits from Iranian oil for decades, through a deeply inequitable agreement. Britain responded with an embargo and a naval blockade, crippling Iran's economy. When diplomatic pressure failed, British intelligence, specifically the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, began plotting Mossadegh's removal. They found a willing partner in the newly formed CIA, led by Director Allen Dulles and his brother, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, who viewed Mossadegh through the absolutist lens of the Cold War. Despite Mossadegh's staunch anti-communist stance and his battles with Iran's Communist Two-Day Party, Washington was persuaded by British whispers and its own fear of Soviet expansion that Iran was teetering on the brink. The plan, codenamed Ajax by the CIA, was approved by President Dwight Eisenhower in the summer of 1953. The operational architect on the ground was Kermit Roosevelt, Jr., grandson of Theodore Roosevelt and a career CIA officer. Roosevelt did not arrive with an army, but with a suitcase of money, millions of dollars authorized for the operation. The CIA's strategy was a masterclass in political subversion. First, they built a powerful propaganda apparatus. Using local agents and purchased journalists, they flooded Iranian newspapers with anti-Mossadegh stories, painting him as a madman, a British agent, a communist sympathizer, and a Jewish descendant, all contradictory but effective smears. They printed and distributed thousands of pamphlets and commissioned cartoons designed to undermine his legitimacy. Simultaneously, They forged close ties with key factions within the Iranian military, particularly royalist officers loyal to the Shah, and with influential religious leaders and bazaar merchants, stoking fears of communism and secularism. The coup attempt initially appeared to fail. On August 15, 1953, the Shah, nervous and hesitant, signed royal decrees dismissing Mossadegh and appointing General Fazlollah Zahedi as prime minister, as per the CIA plan. The officer sent to deliver the decree was arrested by Mossadegh's loyalists. The Shah, fearing retribution, fled to Baghdad and then to Rome. In Tehran, Mossadegh's supporters poured into the streets in celebration, believing they had defeated a royalist conspiracy. But this was precisely the scenario Roosevelt and his team had planned for. They activated Phase 2, the manufactured spontaneous revolt. Using their network of paid agents, including street thugs and wrestlers from the city's Zerkhane's traditional gyms, the CIA orchestrated two streams of demonstrations. One stream, posing as communists from the two-day party, was directed to launch violent attacks on religious symbols and conservative leaders, deliberately provoking a backlash from the clergy and the middle class. The other, larger stream was a pro-Shah demonstration, funded and directed by CIA agents who bussed in people from the outskirts and distributed money and pictures of the Shah. The critical turning point came on August 19. As the CIA-paid mob swelled, key army units that had been bribed and assured of American support finally moved. Tanks rolled into central Tehran and surrounded Mossadegh's residence. After a brief, bloody clash with his loyal guards, the house was stormed. Mossadegh surrendered, was later tried, and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. The Shah returned from exile, his power now utterly dependent on American support and his own ruthless secret police, SAVAK, which was created and trained by the CIA and Israel's Mossad. The immediate objective was achieved. Western oil interests were secured through a new consortium, though the U.S. now held a dominant share over Britain. But the long-term consequences were catastrophic and continue to reverberate. Operation Ajax destroyed the nascent Iranian democracy and secular nationalism, replacing it with an autocracy that relied on repression. It politicized the Iranian clergy, who saw firsthand how secular nationalism could be crushed by foreign powers, pushing them toward a more activist, anti-Western stance. It bred a deep, generational hatred of America as a manipulative, imperial force, a sentiment that directly fueled the anti-Western fervor of the 1979 Islamic Revolution. The operation became a model for future CIA interventions in Guatemala, Congo, Chile, and elsewhere, proving that governments could be toppled from within. It rewrote the political DNA of a region, setting Iran and the United States on a collision course that defines geopolitics to this day. The declassified cables and internal memos show no reckoning with these blowback effects. They show only the cold calculus of a short-term strategic victory, a template for rewriting history from the shadows. Operation Northwoods, the Pentagon's blueprint for a false flag war. If Operation Ajax represents the covert manipulation of an existing political crisis, then Operation Northwoods stands as the most chilling and explicit proposal in the declassified annals of the Cold War. A detailed, top-secret plan drafted by the highest ranks of the United States military to fabricate a pretext for a full-scale invasion of Cuba by staging grotesque acts of terrorism against American citizens and military assets, and blaming them on Fidel Castro. The very existence of this 1962 document, approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and presented to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, rewrites our understanding of the limits of national security strategy during the Cuban Missile Crisis era. It reveals a mindset within the military establishment where the ends, the removal of Castro's communist regime, were seen to justify literally any means, including mass murder and the betrayal of public trust on a staggering scale. The declassified Northwoods memo, part of the Assassination Records Review Board's releases in the late 1990s, is not a speculative think tank paper. It is an actionable operational draft, complete with tactical planning and a cynical understanding of propaganda, which proposed to manipulate the American people into a righteous war fury through a campaign of orchestrated lies and bloodshed. The context is crucial. By 1962, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion had humiliated the Kennedy administration, and Castro's Cuba remained a glaring symbol of communist expansion in America's backyard. The Pentagon and the CIA were under intense pressure to develop new, more effective plans to destabilize or overthrow Castro. Operation Northwoods was the military's contribution, born from the Joint Chiefs Cuba project, codenamed Operation Mongoose. Chaired by General Lyman Lemnitzer, the Joint Chiefs drafted and signed off on a document titled Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. Its central, horrifying premise was straightforward, since Castro would not provide an overt act of war against the U.S. The U.S. should create the illusion of one. The proposals listed in the memo are a catalog of state-sponsored terror. One plan involved simulating attacks on the U.S. military base at Guantanamo Bay. We could blow up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba. The document states flatly, adding that casualty lists in U.S. newspapers would cause a helpful wave of national indignation. Another proposed orchestrating a terror campaign in Miami, other Florida cities, and even Washington, D.C. The plan suggested hijacking civilian aircraft, simulating shoot-downs of civilian and military planes, sinking boats of Cuban refugees, and destroying a remote-controlled drone aircraft to be portrayed as a commercial airliner full of college students on a holiday. Perhaps the most morally bankrupt suggestion was to use the potential death of astronaut John Glenn during his upcoming Mercury space flight as a pretext. The document coolly notes that if Glenn's rocket exploded, the objective is to provide irrevocable proof that the fault lies with the communists. Every scenario was designed with a propagandist's eye. They planned to conduct these operations using fake Cuban military equipment, leave forged documents, and employ Cuban exile assets to create authentic evidence of Cuban aggression. The memo concludes with the confident assertion that the American public and international opinion could be swayed by a series of well-coordinated incidents, and that the resulting outrage would provide the justification for the U.S. to launch a necessary military invasion to liberate Cuba. President John F. Kennedy and his civilian Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, rejected the Northwoods proposal out of hand. McNamara, upon receiving the memo from General Lemnitzer, reportedly dismissed it immediately and forbade the Joint Chiefs from ever raising such ideas again. This rejection is often cited as evidence of the system working, of civilian control over a rogue military. However, the declassified record suggests a more complex and disturbing reality. The mere fact that the nation's top military leaders collectively developed, refined, and formally recommended a strategy of mass murder and deceit against their own populace indicates a profound institutional breakdown. It demonstrates that the concept of a false flag operation, long considered the province of conspiracy theory, was actively contemplated at the highest levels of the American government. Furthermore, Northwoods was not an isolated brainstorm. It was part of a larger, aggressive covert program, Operation Mongoose, which included plans for assassination, economic sabotage, and psychological warfare. The mindset that produced Northwoods did not vanish with its rejection. The historical rewriting here is twofold. First, it fundamentally alters the heroic narrative of the Cuban Missile Crisis. While Kennedy is rightly praised for his diplomatic skill and restraint in October 1962, this occurred against a backdrop where his own military chiefs had, just months earlier, proposed sparking a war with Cuba through terrorist atrocities. The crisis management in the White House was not just dealing with Soviet missiles, but also with a domestic military establishment capable of extreme, reckless thinking. Second, Northwoods provides a legitimate historical reference point for understanding later, more shadowy events. It establishes a proven precedent for the U.S. security apparatus contemplating false flag terrorism. This does not prove such operations were later executed, but it destroys the argument that they are unthinkable. The memo's release has fueled decades of re-examination of other tragic, unclear events, from the Gulf of Tonkin incident to 9/11, not by proving conspiracy, but by proving precedent. It reveals that in the dark calculus of Cold War confrontation, the lives of citizens were sometimes viewed as expendable pawns in a larger geopolitical game. Operation Northwoods remains the smoking gun of intent, a classified operation that never moved beyond the planning stage, but whose very conception rewrites our understanding of the moral boundaries within the national security state during a period we once viewed through a simpler lens of good versus evil. Operation Gladio, NATO's secret armies and the strategy of tension. Emerging from the literal ashes of World War II, a clandestine network was woven into the very fabric of Western Europe. A network so secret that its existence was categorically denied for decades, and whose exposed threads revealed a chilling paradox. The democratic states of NATO, in their zeal to prevent a communist takeover, had created and maintained hidden armies willing to manipulate terrorism and subvert their own nation's politics. This was Operation Gladio, the code name for the Italian branch of a much wider, coordinated project of stay-behind armies across Western Europe. The story, which exploded into public consciousness in 1990 with the revelations of Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti, rewrites the history of post-war Europe, suggesting that the continent's political stability was not merely a triumph of democracy over extremism, but was also, in part, secretly managed, and at times violently destabilized, by unelected intelligence agencies operating under a NATO mandate. The declassified documents and judicial investigations, particularly in Italy and Belgium, paint a picture of a shadow structure that blurred the lines between defense and offense, between protecting democracy and perpetrating acts of terror to discredit political opponents and manipulate public opinion, a tactic that became known as the strategy of tension. The genesis of Gladio lies in the immediate post-war period. As the Iron Curtain descended, Western military planners, led by the British Special Operations Executive, SO, and later the American CIA, feared a conventional Soviet invasion or, more plausibly, an internal communist takeover via political subversion in fragile democracies like Italy and France. To prepare for this, they organized clandestine, stay-behind networks, cells of carefully vetted anti-communist civilians and military personnel, equipped with hidden arms caches, secure communications, and safe houses. Their official purpose was to form a resistance nucleus in the event of a Warsaw Pact occupation, similar to the World War II resistance movements. The networks were coordinated nationally by each country's intelligence service and internationally through a NATO committee with the benign-sounding name Allied Clandestine Committee, AC, and its precursor, the Clandestine Planning Committee, CPC. For decades, the existence of these armies was one of the West's most closely guarded secrets. The profound historical rewrite begins not with the Army's creation, but with their alleged operational shift in the 1960s and 1970s. As the perceived threat evolved from outright invasion to the political rise of strong communist parties in Italy and socialist movements elsewhere, elements within these networks and their intelligence handlers are alleged to have pivoted from a defensive, stay-behind posture to an offensive strategy of tension. The theory, supported by extensive investigations by Italian magistrates like Felis Casson, posits that Gladio operatives or factions linked to them were involved in orchestrating or facilitating a series of devastating far-right terrorist bombings across Italy. The goal was to create a climate of fear and instability, tension, that the public would blame on left-wing extremists, thereby discrediting the Italian Communist Party, PCI, and justifying a stronger, more authoritarian state, possibly even a coup. The canonical event in this narrative is the Piazza Fontana bombing in Milan on December 12, 1969, which killed 17 people and wounded 88. Initial investigations pointed falsely at anarchists, but decades of judicial work revealed a labyrinthine trail leading to far-right groups like Ordine Nuovo, with tantalizing connections to Italian military intelligence, SISMI, and, by alleged proxy, to the Gladio structure. The evidence is complex and often circumstantial, built from weapon caches, defector testimonies, and mysterious deaths of informants. However, the sheer weight of investigative findings and political admissions is staggering. When Prime Minister Andreotti finally acknowledged the Italian Gladio's existence in 1990, he confirmed it had been involved in unauthorized activities. A 2000 report by an Italian parliamentary commission concluded that the strategy of tension pursued by elements within the state had sought to stop the PCI and, to a lesser degree, from reaching executive power. Even more damning are the transnational links. Investigations into other bombings, such as the 1972 Pitino attack and the 1980 Bologna railway station massacre, Europe's deadliest post-war terrorist attack until the Madrid bombings, further entangled neo-fascist groups with intelligence agents. In Belgium, the revelation of its stay-behind network, Esdra 8, became intertwined with the terrifying and still unsolved Brabant killers spree in the 1980s. The ultimate rewrite Operation Gladio forces is the reevaluation of the years of lead in Italy and similar periods of terrorism across Europe. It suggests that what appeared as a chaotic battle between extremist fringe groups on the left and right was, in fact, a shadow war with a third, hidden actor, a state-sanctioned, NATO-tolerated apparatus that may have manipulated and exacerbated the violence to steer political outcomes. This does not absolve the terrorists who planted the bombs, but it fundamentally recontextualizes them, suggesting they were at times assets or puppets in a larger, colder game. The operation reveals that the defense of the democratic West was not always conducted by democratic means, and that the victory of liberal democracy in the Cold War may have been secured in part through a secret and profoundly illiberal bargain with the forces of chaos and fear. The Lavon affair, Israel's false flag in Egypt and the birth of a doctrine in the covert annals of the Middle East, few operations have had as profound and paradoxical an impact as the botched 1954 sabotage campaign in Egypt, an event known variously as Operation Susanna, the Lavon affair, or in Hebrew, Esek ha-Bish, the bad business. This was not a grand, sweeping geopolitical maneuver, but a small, dirty, and disastrous series of bombings targeting American and British civilian facilities in Alexandria and Cairo. Its historical significance, however, is monumental. It was a deliberate false flag operation designed by Israeli military intelligence to appear as the work of Egyptian nationalists, with the goal of poisoning Egypt's relations with the West and scuttling a pivotal British withdrawal from the Suez Canal zone. The operation's exposure did the opposite, triggering a political earthquake in Israel that toppled a defense minister, shattered the reputation of its intelligence community, and exposed a ruthless, risk-embracing national security doctrine in its infancy. Yet, the declassified files and decades of investigative journalism reveal a deeper, more unsettling truth. The Lavon affair was not an isolated rogue mission, but a foundational event that helped crystallize Israel's strategy of war by other means. A strategy of covert action, strategic deception, and calculated audacity that would define its approach to regional adversaries for generations. The geopolitical context of 1954 was one of precarious transition. The revolutionary regime of Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt was consolidating power, its anti-colonial and pan-Arab rhetoric a direct threat to Israel. Crucially, Britain was negotiating its final military withdrawal from the Suez Canal base, a move Israel feared would create a power vacuum Nasser would fill, unfettered by a Western military presence. Israeli Prime Minister Moshe Sharett favored diplomacy, but a powerful faction within the defense establishment, led by Defense Minister Pinhas Lavon and senior figures in Military Intelligence Unit 131, advocated for aggressive covert action to shape events. Their plan was chillingly simple: activate a dormant Jewish spy cell in Egypt. Young, idealistic Egyptian Jews recruited years prior, and have them plant incendiary devices in post offices, libraries, and cinemas frequented by Americans and Britons. The bombs were designed to cause property damage and panic, not mass casualties. The goal was to create an impression of violent, unstable Egyptian nationalism, convincing Britain and the United States that Nasser could not be trusted and that a continued Western military presence was essential for stability. In essence, Israel would commit acts of terrorism against its own allies to manipulate their foreign policy. The operation commenced in July 1954. Initial bombings succeeded, causing minor damage. But on July 23, during an attempt to plant a device in a cinema in Alexandria, a young operative named Philip Natanson was caught when the bomb ignited prematurely in his pocket. His arrest led to the rapid rounding up of the entire network. Under torture by Egyptian authorities, the operatives confessed. The subsequent trial in Cairo was a global spectacle, resulting in 2 death sentences, carried out against Moshe Marzouk and Shmuel Azar, long prison terms for others, and a devastating propaganda victory for Nasser, who used it to portray Israel as a terrorist state. In Israel, a crisis of denial and recrimination erupted. Defense Minister Pinhas Lavon denied authorizing the operation, blaming overzealous intelligence officers. The head of military intelligence, Binyamin Ghibli, insisted he had received verbal approval from Lavon. This, who gave the order? Controversy paralyzed the government for a decade, leading to Lavon's forced resignation in 1955 and contributing to Sharett's eventual political demise, clearing the path for the more hawkish David Ben-Gurion to return to power. The official Israeli line for decades was one of ambiguity and shame, treating the affair as a tragic mistake. However, the release of key documents and the investigative work of scholars like Shabtai Tiveth have rewritten this narrative. They reveal that Operation Susanna was a deliberate, calculated policy choice, not a rogue aberration. It embodied a specific strategic philosophy championed by figures like Lavon and the young Moshe Dayan, that Israel, surrounded and outnumbered, must proactively create facts on the ground and manipulate its environment through daring covert ops. The failure was one of execution and political fallout, not of concept. In this light, the Lavon affair becomes a critical pivot point. Its immediate consequence was the collapse of Sharrat's moderate government and the ascendance of the activist Ben-Gurion faction, which would launch the preemptive Suez War just 2 years later. More profoundly, it served as a brutal but formative lesson for the Israeli intelligence community. The Mossad, formally established in 1951 but still finding its footing, learned from the amateurish tradecraft and poor compartmentalization of the military's Unit 131. The affair led to a professionalization and centralization of covert operations under the Mossad's mantle, fostering a culture of deniability and ruthless efficiency. The doctrine of covert action, of assassinations, sabotage, and psychological warfare was not discarded after the Lavon failure. It was refined. The operation's legacy is a paradox, a humiliating public failure that secretly hardened and professionalized Israel's commitment to an aggressive, shadow war doctrine. It demonstrated that a state could, and in Israel's view must, wage war without declared borders, using any tool available to survive in a hostile region. The bombs in Alexandria, meant to alter British policy, ultimately did something far more significant. They helped forge the clandestine identity of the Israeli state itself. Operation INFEKTION, the KGB's AIDS disinformation campaign, in the twilight of the Cold War, as the world grappled with the terrifying emergence of a new and mysterious pandemic. A shadow war was being waged not with bullets or bombs, but with a weapon far more insidious, a meticulously crafted lie. This was Operation INFEKTION, the Soviet KGB's codename for one of the most successful and destructive disinformation campaigns of the 20th century. Its objective was not military conquest, but the systematic erosion of American moral and political authority on the global stage. The narrative it planted, that the HIV/AIDS virus was not a natural zoonotic disease, but a man-made biological weapon engineered by the United States military at Fort Detrick, transcended the realm of spycraft to infect world public opinion, sowing distrust, fueling anti-Americanism, and causing profound human suffering by stigmatizing victims and undermining scientific cooperation. The declassified archives of the Stasi, East Germany's secret police, and the post-Soviet revelations of former KGB officers provide a near-complete blueprint of this psychological operation, revealing how a totalitarian state weaponized a public health catastrophe to rewrite geopolitical narratives, a tactic that has found frightening resonance in the digital age of fake news and viral conspiracy. The operation was born in the early 1980s, a period of Soviet strategic weakness. The USSR was economically stagnant, politically rigid, and facing a resurgent, technologically superior United States under President Ronald Reagan. The Politburo, led by Yuri Andropov, a former KGB chief himself, saw information warfare as a cost-effective way to counter American power. The emergence of AIDS presented a perfect vector. The disease first gained attention in the United States among gay men and injection drug users, groups already marginalized and often viewed with prejudice globally. The Soviet apparatus saw an opportunity to portray the epidemic as a moral and biological consequence of American decadence. But the KGB, in collaboration with its Bulgarian and East German allies, decided to go far beyond mere schadenfreude. They would actively construct and propagate a pseudoscientific conspiracy theory of breathtaking scope. The genesis of the lie is often traced to a 1983 letter published in The Patriot, a pro-Soviet Indian newspaper, which made the first explicit claim that AIDS was a Pentagon bioweapon. This was no random crank letter. It was the opening salvo of a coordinated campaign. The KGB's service, responsible for active measures and disinformation, crafted the narrative, drawing on a patchwork of pre-existing tropes: Western biological weapons research, racist myths about African origins, and classic Cold War fears. The story was then laundered through a global network of sympathetic journalists, communist parties, and front organizations. It appeared in Soviet-controlled media like Literaturnaya Gazeta, but its most impactful dissemination came through the non-aligned press in Africa and Asia. A pivotal moment was the 1986 publication of a lengthy article by East German biologist Jakob Segel and his wife Lily. Though presented as independent academic work, their paper, which claimed HIV was synthesized from 2 animal viruses at Fort Detrick, was almost certainly a product of Stasi disinformation efforts, designed to give the theory a veneer of scientific credibility. The effects of Operation INFEKTION were catastrophic and long-lasting. In the United States, the theory was embraced by some black nationalist groups and conspiracy theorists, deepening existing societal fractures and fueling distrust of government health agencies. Internationally, the damage was far worse. Across Africa, where the pandemic was taking a devastating toll, the narrative that AIDS was a Western plot to commit genocide against people of color found fertile ground. This bred profound suspicion of Western doctors, foreign aid workers, and life-saving public health initiatives, from condom distribution to antiretroviral drug trials. It provided a convenient scapegoat for corrupt or incompetent governments who could blame a foreign power rather than address the crisis through education and health care. The campaign successfully recast a tragic natural disaster as a deliberate act of American imperialism, poisoning diplomatic relations and hindering the global fight against the disease for years. The operation's exposure began with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Stasi files captured in East Germany provided concrete evidence of the disinformation chain. Former KGB officer Vasily Mitrokhin's defection and the subsequent Mitrokhin Archive confirmed the KGB's central role. In 1992, the head of Russian foreign intelligence, Yevgeny Primakov, formally admitted to the Soviet Union's role in spreading false rumors about the United States and AIDS. The historical rewrite here is profound. Operation INFEKTION demonstrates that the Cold War's final battles were fought not only with proxy armies and missile treaties, but in the nebulous realm of perception. It shows how a state can weaponize information, exploiting fear and prejudice to achieve strategic aims without firing a shot. Furthermore, it serves as the direct progenitor of modern hybrid warfare tactics. The techniques perfected by the KGB, forging documents, creating fake experts, exploiting media ecosystems, are the same tools used by today's state actors in cyber influence campaigns. The AIDS lie did not die with the USSR. It mutated, finding new life on the internet, influencing public discourse during subsequent health crises like Ebola and COVID-19. Operation INFEKTION rewrites history by revealing that our contemporary post-truth era, with its deep distrust of institutions and expertise, was not born spontaneously with social media. It was, in part, a carefully engineered outcome of a clandestine war waged by a dying empire, a final, poisonous gift from the Cold War that continues to shape how we interpret disease, science, and power. The My Lai massacre cover-up, from atrocity to public reckoning. On the morning of March 16, 1968, in the hamlet of My Lai in South Vietnam, soldiers of the U.S. Army's American division crossed a line that separated warfare from barbarism. Over the course of 4 hours, they systematically murdered between 347 and 504 unarmed Vietnamese civilians, men, women, children, and infants, in what stands as the most infamous American war crime of the 20th century. Yet, the historical significance of My Lai lies not only in the horror of the event itself, but in the elaborate, multi-layered operation to conceal it, an operation that stretched from the field command in Vietnam to the highest levels of the U.S. military and civilian government. For over a year, the massacre was successfully buried, rewritten in official reports as a victorious battle against Viet Cong forces. Its eventual exposure was not the result of military justice or governmental transparency, but of the dogged efforts of a few individuals outside the chain of command. The declassified Pentagon papers, internal Army investigations, and personal correspondence reveal a cover-up of staggering breadth, a concerted effort to protect the institution's image at the cost of truth, a decision that fundamentally rewrote America's relationship with its own military and its understanding of the Vietnam War. The cover-up began almost immediately. The Operational After Action report, filed by the commander of the involved company, Captain Ernest Medna, claimed 128 enemy killed and the capture of 3 weapons, a patently impossible ratio that should have raised immediate flags. Soldiers from the unit who witnessed or participated in the killings were told by officers to keep quiet. When a helicopter crew, led by Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, had intervened during the massacre by landing their aircraft between soldiers and fleeing villagers, their subsequent reports of war crimes were dismissed or ignored up the chain of command. The first official investigation was a sham. The American Division's commanding general, Samuel Coster, ordered an inquiry led by a junior officer, which concluded no misconduct had occurred. For a full year, the official record stated that a hard-fought battle had taken place in Pinkville, a Viet Cong stronghold. The mechanism of the cover-up was a combination of institutional self-preservation, willful blindness, and the fog of war narrative. The Army, reeling from the Tet offensive and engaged in a brutal counterinsurgency, had institutional incentives to classify any excessive violence as a legitimate combat outcome. The body count metric, a perverse measure of success, encouraged inflated numbers and turned a blind eye to how those numbers were achieved. At My Lai, the chain of command from company to division level actively suppressed the truth. This was not merely a passive failure, it was an active operation of obfuscation. Reports were altered, witnesses were discouraged, and a wall of silence was constructed. The cover-up reached its zenith when news of the event began to leak to Washington. Even after a soldier named Ronald Ridenhour, who had heard accounts from participants, sent a detailed letter to the Pentagon and Congress in March 1969, the Army's initial internal response was slow and aimed at damage control. It was only when investigative journalist Seymour Hersh, working off of Ridenhour's tips, began publishing his shocking reports in late 1969 that the dam broke. The exposure of My Lai and its cover-up triggered a historical reckoning that rewrote the domestic narrative of the Vietnam War. Prior to November 1969, the dominant debate was over strategy and cost. After the photographs of slaughtered families hit the front pages, the debate became moral. The good American soldier archetype was shattered. The war was no longer seen by a growing segment of the public as a well-intentioned mistake, but as a corrupting, immoral enterprise that could turn ordinary young men into monsters. The credibility of the U.S. government and military, already damaged by the Tet offensive and the Pentagon Papers revelation, was destroyed. The cover-up proved to be more politically damaging than the crime itself. It demonstrated that the institution could not be trusted to police itself. This led directly to the end of the military draft and the creation of the all-volunteer force, a profound shift in American civil-military relations. It fueled the anti-war movement with a potent, undeniable symbol of the war's horror. Legally, the aftermath was a disappointment. Only one man, Lieutenant William Calley, was convicted. His sentence was repeatedly reduced, and he served only 3 years of house arrest. The higher-ranking officers who orchestrated the cover-up, including General Custer, received only administrative reprimands. This outcome sent a chilling message about accountability. The historical rewrite is thus dual-layered. First, My Lai exposed the dark underbelly of counterinsurgency and the brutalizing nature of the Vietnam conflict in a way no statistic ever could. Second, and perhaps more enduringly, the cover-up operation revealed the lengths to which a bureaucratic institution will go to protect itself, even in the face of profound evil. It established a template for public skepticism toward official military accounts that would resonate through future conflicts, from El Mazout to Abu Ghraib. The event forced a painful national self-examination about the myths of American exceptionalism in warfare. The files show that the truth was known and suppressed at multiple levels, not lost in confusion. Therefore, My Lai stands not as an aberrant tragedy, but as a case study in institutional failure and the vital, fragile role of whistleblowers and a free press in a democracy at war. The cover-up operation sought to erase a massacre from history. Its failure etched that massacre permanently into the American conscience as a warning. Operation Condor, the international machinery of state terror. Beyond the shadow of a single nation's covert actions lies the architecture of a transnational conspiracy so vast and systematic that it redefines our understanding of state-sponsored terror in the late 20th century. This was Operation Condor, a clandestine network formed in the 1970s by the right-wing military dictatorships of South America, with the crucial logistical, financial, and intelligence support of the United States. Its purpose was not espionage, but extermination. The coordinated cross-border kidnapping, torture, disappearance, and assassination of left-wing dissidents, students, trade unionists, and intellectuals deemed subversive by the regimes. Declassified U.S. State Department, CIA, and FBI documents, along with archives recovered from the terror states themselves, like the Archives of Terror discovered in Paraguay in 1992, reveal Condor not as a series of isolated atrocities, but as a formalized multinational bureaucracy of death. It rewrites the history of the Cold War in Latin America, exposing it not as a battle of ideologies, but as a continent-wide campaign of state terror, enabled and often directed from Washington, that killed tens of thousands and left a legacy of trauma and impunity that endures to this day. The genesis of Condor lay in the shared paranoia of the region's anti-communist dictators. Following the 1973 coup in Chile that brought General Augusto Pinochet to power, and similar takeovers in Uruguay, Argentina, Bolivia, Paraguay, and Brazil, these regimes found common cause. They faced a mobile, transnational opposition, exiles who organized abroad, guerrilla networks that crossed borders, and intellectual movements that shared ideas internationally. To counter this, the intelligence services of Chile, DINA, Argentina side, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, and later Peru and Ecuador formalized their collaboration. The pact was sealed at a series of secret meetings in 1975 with Santiago, Chile, as its nerve center. Operation Condor had 3 escalating phases as outlined in declassified CIA cables. Phase 1 was the simple exchange of intelligence. Phase 2, coordinated covert action, including cross-border surveillance and abductions. Phase 3, the most secret and deadly, involved the formation of special teams of assassins from member countries to travel anywhere in the world to hunt down and eliminate Condor enemies. The operational mechanics of Condor were chilling in their bureaucratic efficiency. Member states established direct encrypted communication links, bypassing normal diplomatic channels. They shared lists of targets, fingerprints, photographs, and dossiers. When a person of interest fled, say, Uruguay for Argentina, DINA agents would liaise with their Argentine counterparts to have the person detained, tortured for information, and then often disappeared, a term that entered the global lexicon from this period. The most infamous demonstration of Phase 3 was the 1976 car bomb assassination of former Chilean ambassador Orlando Letelier and his American colleague Ronnie Moffett in the heart of Washington, D.C. Declassified U.S. documents prove that DINA chief Manuel Contreras, a paid CIA asset, ordered the hit, and that the CIA had prior intelligence suggesting such an international assassination was being planned, but failed to warn U.S. authorities adequately. This event, more than any other, forced a reluctant U.S. Congress to begin investigating Condor. The role of the United States, as revealed in declassified files, is the most contentious and historically significant aspect of the rewrite. The U.S. did not create Condor. The initiative came from the Southern Cone regimes. However, through multiple administrations, Nixon, Ford, and initially Carter, U.S. agencies provided the essential infrastructure and a permissive environment. The CIA and the U.S. military, through training programs like those at the School of the Americas, had educated and indoctrinated many of the officers who would become Condor's architects and executioners. They provided technical assistance for intelligence gathering and communication. Critically, they supplied vast amounts of military aid and economic support that propped up the very dictatorships engaging in terror. Declassified memos show that U.S. officials were aware of Condor's murderous nature as early as 1976. A now infamous State Department cable from that year notes that Condor members were planning joint operations against terrorists, and that Phase 3 would involve the formation of special teams from member countries to travel anywhere in the world to non-member countries to carry out punishments, including assassination. The U.S. response was muted, prioritizing anti-communist solidarity over human rights. Operation Condor rewrites history by exposing the globalization of repression. It shows that the dirty war was not a series of national tragedies, but an internationally linked system. The body count is staggering. An estimated 60,000 to 80,000 deaths and disappearances across the continent are attributed to the Condor regimes. Its exposure, driven by relentless human rights lawyers, journalists, and the gradual opening of archives, has forced a slow and painful reckoning. Trials in Argentina, Chile, and Italy have convicted former dictators and intelligence chiefs for Condor-era crimes, establishing universal jurisdiction for crimes against humanity. For the United States, the declassified record is an indelible stain, revealing a foreign policy that, in the name of containing communism, became complicit in a campaign of terror that targeted not just armed insurgents, but an entire generation of political and civil society. Operation Condor stands as the definitive evidence that the Cold War's fiercest battles in the global South were fought not between armies, but by secret policemen in unmarked cars, operating with a license to kill granted by an international pact and a willful blindness in Washington. It is history written not in treaties, but in mass graves and declassified cables that whisper of a conspiracy of silence among states. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, the fabricated casus belli, the official history of America's deep and direct entry into the Vietnam War is anchored to 2 nights in August 1964 in the Gulf of Tonkin. The narrative, presented to the American public and Congress with urgent certainty by the Johnson administration, was clear and compelling. On August 2, North Vietnamese torpedo boats launched an unprovoked attack on the U.S. destroyer Maddox. On August 4, under cover of darkness and stormy weather, they attacked again, targeting both the Maddox and its companion, the Sea, Turner Joy. In response to these acts of aggression, President Lyndon B. Johnson went on national television and ordered retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnamese naval bases. More consequentially, he sent to Congress the Southeast Asia Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which authorized him to take all necessary measures to defend U.S. forces and prevent further aggression. A functional declaration of war used to justify the massive escalation of U.S. combat involvement for nearly a decade. Yet, declassified National Security Agency (NSA) documents, internal Pentagon communications, and the testimony of crew members have systematically dismantled this foundational myth. The rewrite reveals that the second, critical attack on August 4 never happened. It was a phantom, a product of misread sonar, over-eager sonarmen, jangled nerves, and most damningly, a willful or opportunistic misinterpretation by senior officials in Washington who were actively seeking a pretext for war. To understand the operation to fabricate this casus belli, one must first understand the covert operations already underway. The Maddox was not on an innocent patrol in international waters. It was part of a signals intelligence SIGINT mission, collecting radar and communications data on North Vietnam, in direct support of clandestine South Vietnamese commando raids, Oplan 34A, against North Vietnamese coastal installations. These raids, commanded and funded by the CIA, had been escalating for months. On August 2, the Maddox was indeed approached by 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats. Declassified documents show the North Vietnamese likely believed the destroyer was involved in the raids. The Maddox fired warning shots. The torpedo boats launched torpedoes and machine gun fire. In the ensuing skirmish, U.S. aircraft from the carrier Ticonderoga damaged the boats. This was a real, though ambiguous, engagement in waters claimed by Hanoi. The Johnson administration, however, chose to portray it as an unambiguous act of piracy on the high seas. The critical night of August 4 was a maelstrom of confusion and, later, deception. The Maddox and Sea, Turner Joy, operating in poor weather, began receiving sporadic and ambiguous sonar and radar returns. Crew reports spoke of torpedo wakes and enemy radar contacts. For several hours, the ships maneuvered aggressively, firing at radar ghosts and sonar shadows. Captain John J. Herrick of the Maddox, aboard the ship, quickly grew skeptical. Just hours after the initial reports, he sent a flash cable to Pacific Command stating, "Review of action makes many reported contacts and torpedoes fired appear doubtful. Freak weather effects and over-eager sonarmen may have accounted for many reports. No actual visual sightings by Maddox. Suggest complete evaluation before any further action." This cable, which utterly undermined the case for a retaliatory strike, was received in Washington. Yet, it was ignored or discounted. President Johnson and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara were already preparing the public and congressional response based on the initial, alarmist reports. The declassified NSA study, finally released in 2005, provides the smoking gun. It concludes definitively that the August 4 attack was a fiction. More critically, it reveals that SIGINT intercepts of North Vietnamese communications, which senior officials, including McNamara, cited to Congress as unequivocal proof of the attack, showed no such thing. In fact, the intercepts indicated the North Vietnamese were trying to assess what had happened to their boats on August 2, and were reacting to the U.S. strikes already underway on the 4th. McNamara, in his 1964 testimony, knowingly presented these intercepts out of context to provide a false veneer of intelligence certainty. This was not a simple intelligence failure. It was the active construction of a false narrative. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed Congress with only 2 dissenting votes, granting Johnson the blanket authority he sought. The war escalated from 16,000 advisors to over 500,000 ground troops. The rewrite of this history is therefore one of the most consequential of the 20th century. It exposes that the primary legal and political justification for a decade of war, which cost over 58,000 American and upwards of 2 million Vietnamese lives, was built on a lie, or at best, a useful misunderstanding that officials in power had no desire to clarify. It established a pattern of manufactured consent for war that would be studied and arguably echoed in later conflicts. The Gulf of Tonkin incident stands as a permanent lesson in the dangers of secretive executive power, the manipulation of intelligence, and the catastrophic human cost that can result when the machinery of state is operated to create a desired reality, rather than respond to one. Operation Paperclip, the scientists of the Third Reich and the foundations of the American century. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, as the victorious Allies scoured the ruins of the Third Reich for the secrets of its terrifying technological prowess, a secret and morally fraught operation was launched that would fundamentally reshape the scientific, military, and geopolitical landscape of the 20th century. This was Operation Paperclip, a program run by the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, JIOA, to recruit, exfiltrate, and employ more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians, including many who were ardent Nazis and complicit in war crimes. The public rationale was to deny this intellectual capital to the Soviet Union and harness it for American advantage in the burgeoning Cold War. The declassified files, however, reveal a systematic campaign to whitewash the pasts of these individuals, circumventing explicit presidential orders and immigration laws to bring them into the heart of the U.S. military-industrial complex. The historical rewrite here is profound. The technological foundations of America's post-war supremacy in rocketry, aerospace, chemical weapons, and medicine were not solely born of American ingenuity, but were crucially accelerated by the brains behind the V-2 rocket that terrorized London, the engineers of the Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter, and the physicians who conducted deadly experiments on concentration camp inmates. Operation Paperclip challenges the clean narrative of the good war and forces a reckoning with the pragmatic, and often cynical, bargains struck in the name of national security. The most famous contingent of Paperclip recruits were the rocket scientists led by Wernher von Braun, the technical director of the V-2 program at Peenemünde. The V-2 was a revolutionary ballistic missile, but its production was a horror story. It was built by slave labor from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp under brutal conditions that resulted in the deaths of an estimated 20,000 prisoners. Von Braun and his team were not distant administrators. They were intimately involved in the program, selecting and visiting labor sites, and petitioning the SS for more workers. In 1945, knowing the war was lost, von Braun's group deliberately surrendered to the Americans, understanding their value. U.S. Army officers, recognizing the prize, immediately hid them from rival Allied teams. Back in Washington, a fierce debate erupted. President Truman's official policy, Directives JCS 1067 and 1074, explicitly forbade the recruitment of any active Nazis. The GIOA, under the Pentagon, circumvented this by systematically sanitizing the dossiers of their chosen scientists. Overt Nazi party memberships, SS affiliations, and evidence of war crimes were omitted, downplayed, or reclassified. Von Braun's file, for instance, described him as a political non-entity, despite his SS rank of Sturmbannführer, Major. This was not an oversight. It was official policy to obscure the truth. The operation's scope extended far beyond rocketry. It included aeronautical engineers like Kurt Tank, designer of the Focke-Wulf fighters, chemical weapons experts like Otto Ambrose, a director of IG Farben, the company that manufactured Zyklon B for the gas chambers and operated the Auschwitz Third Monowitz slave labor camp, and scores of physicians with grotesque pasts. The most egregious cases were from the realm of medicine. Dr. Hubertus Strughold, later hailed as the father of space medicine for his work at the U.S. Air Force School of Aerospace Medicine, had been involved with the Luftwaffe's Aviation Medicine Institute, where experiments used Dachau prisoners, including children. Dr. Walter Schreiber, who advised the U.S. on biological warfare, had served on the tribunal that sentenced prisoners to be used in freezing and typhus experiments at Ravensbrück. Their expertise, gleaned from torture and murder, was absorbed into American research. The historical impact of Paperclip is immense and dual-faceted. On one hand, its proponents argue it was a cold, necessary calculation that won the Cold War. The von Braun team, first at Fort Bliss and later at NASA Marshall Space Flight Center, became the indispensable architects of the American space program. They developed the Redstone rocket that launched America's first satellite, the Jupiter C, and the mighty Saturn V that took astronauts to the moon. Their knowledge provided the cornerstone of the intercontinental ballistic missile ICBM arsenal, the central pillar of nuclear deterrence. In this view, Paperclip was a masterstroke of realpolitik. On the other hand, the operation rewrites the moral aftermath of World War II. It demonstrates that the much-vaunted denazification process was, for an elite class of useful individuals, a sham. It created a precedent where scientific expertise was deemed to transcend moral culpability, establishing a dangerous template for future collaborations with unsavory regimes. It also had direct, harmful consequences. The employment of chemical weapons experts bolstered the U.S.'s own offensive chemical arsenal during the Cold War, and the incorporation of Nazi psychological warfare techniques influenced CIA programs like MK-Ultra. Furthermore, by granting these men prominent, celebrated positions in American society, it inflicted profound and lasting pain on Holocaust survivors, and undermined the very principles of justice the war was supposed to have affirmed. Operation Paperclip forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The technological zenith of the American century, from the conquest of space to the edge of apocalyptic weaponry, was built in part by men whose hands were stained by the crimes of the Third Reich. Their pasts not buried by history, but deliberately erased by a government that decided their future utility was more important than reckoning with their past. The Iran-Contra affair, the shadow government, and the subversion of democracy. If the defining characteristic of a constitutional democracy is the accountability of the executive to the law and to the legislature, then the Iran-Contra affair represents one of the most profound crises in American governance since the Civil War. It was not a single classified operation, but a sprawling, illicit network of covert activities run from the basement of the White House that constituted a direct, deliberate subversion of congressional authority and U.S. law. At its core, it involved two interconnected schemes. First, the secret sale of weapons to the Islamic Republic of Iran, a state sponsor of terrorism under a U.S. arms embargo, in hopes of securing the release of American hostages held in Lebanon. Second, the illegal diversion of the proceeds from those arms sales to fund the CIA-backed Contra rebels fighting to overthrow Nicaragua's leftist Sandinista government, despite an explicit ban on such funding by Congress, the Boland Amendments. The Declassified Tower Commission report, congressional investigations, and the Independent Counsel's inquiry, led by Lawrence Walsh, exposed an extraordinary reality: a parallel foreign policy apparatus, operated by National Security Council staff with the tacit or explicit approval of President Ronald Reagan, that lied to Congress, shredded documents, and constructed a complex web of private intermediaries and offshore bank accounts to conceal its activities. Iran-Contra rewrites the history of the Reagan presidency, revealing not the triumph of conservative principles, but the operation of a shadow government that placed ideological objectives above the rule of law. The operational mechanics were a masterpiece of circumvention. The key architects were National Security Advisor John Poindexter and his deputy, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, a Marine Corps officer detailed to the NSC. North, with the support of CIA Director William Casey, became the nerve center of a neat idea, using private channels and third-country funds to keep the Contras armed and equipped after Congress cut off official aid. This involved a cast of colorful and dubious characters: retired Major General Richard Secord, Israeli arms dealer Manucher Gorbanifar, and Swiss banker Willard Zucker, among others. The scheme to sell weapons to Iran, initiated in 1985, was equally convoluted. Under the guise of a diplomatic opening to Iranian moderates, the U.S. facilitated the sale of TOW and Hawk missiles via Israel, with massive markups. The profits were then funneled through Swiss accounts controlled by Secord and North into covert Contra supply operations. This entire enterprise was deliberately hidden from the State Department, the CIA's own analysts, and most critically from Congress. When questions were asked, false chronologies were created, and North famously began shredding documents. The exposure began in November 1986, when a Lebanese magazine revealed the arms for hostages deal. The resulting firestorm led to the appointment of the Tower Commission and explosive congressional hearings in the summer of 1987, where Oliver North, appearing in uniform, became a polarizing folk hero for some, defiantly defending his actions as patriotic. The investigations, however, uncovered the darker truth. They revealed a culture of secrecy and contempt for legal constraints. Poindexter testified that he deliberately shielded the president from details to give him deniability, a concept that, while legally dubious, pointed to a conscious effort to operate in the shadows. President Reagan's own confused and contradictory statements on his knowledge of the diversions, "I don't recall," severely damaged his credibility. The final report of the Congressional Committee concluded that the affair was characterized by secrecy, deception, and disdain for the law. The historical rewrite of Iran-Contra is multi-layered and enduring. First, it demonstrated that the executive branch could, and did, construct a self-sustaining covert infrastructure to pursue policies explicitly forbidden by the people's representatives. This was not a case of stretching authority. It was a deliberate bypass of the constitutional system of checks and balances. Second, it revealed the dangerous power of an ideologically driven NSC staff, operating without the institutional oversight of established agencies like the CIA or State Department. Third, and perhaps most consequentially, it established a precedent of minimal accountability. While 14 officials were charged, and 11 convicted, including North and Poindexter. All convictions were overturned on appeal, or the defendants were pardoned by President George H.W. Bush in 1992, who had been vice president during the affair. The independent counsel decried the pardons as the final component of the cover-up. The message was clear: high-ranking officials could break significant laws in the name of national security and face no lasting penalty. Thus, Iran-Contra rewrites the legacy of the Reagan era from one of clear-eyed victory in the Cold War to one that also includes a corrosive assault on democratic norms. It provided a playbook for executive overreach that would be referenced, consciously or not, in future crises. It deepened public cynicism about government truthfulness. Most importantly, it proved that within the modern national security state, a powerful faction could operate a secret, self-funding, and self-directing foreign policy, accountable to no one, for years. The affair stands not as a rogue operation, but as a systemic failure, a case study in how a government, in pursuit of its perceived strategic and ideological goals, can become a law unto itself, rewriting the rules of engagement not with foreign adversaries, but with its own constitutional foundation. 10 operations. 10 moments where the secret history diverged violently from the public record. From Tehran to Washington, from Santiago to Moscow, we have traced the outlines of a hidden world, a world where wars are triggered by phantom attacks, where democracies are subverted by their own protectors, and where the truth is treated as the ultimate strategic commodity. The documents are real. The consequences are etched into our present. These are not theories from the fringe, they are facts from the vault. They force us to ask a difficult question. If our recent past was shaped in such darkness, what is being written in the shadows today? Our work to uncover these stories is never finished. If you believe, as we do, that light is the best disinfectant, then subscribe to the Forbidden Archives. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an investigation. And below, leave a comment. Which of these 10 operations do you think had the most profound legacy? The archive awaits your curiosity. Until next time.